Welcome everyone. I think folks are just starting to trickle in. Welcome to the Washington Bike Walk and Roll Summit. We're looking forward to today's keynote. Thank you for joining. I think we're going to start in a couple of minutes. Just want to give people time to join us. Don't know if many of you were able to join us for our morning session. We had about 115 people join us for our Equitable outreach panel this morning. And then we have sessions throughout the week, morning, lunch, and late afternoon, so you can catch us. And then this afternoon's, we have the pleasure of Charles Brown twice today, in that our 4 o'clock session is also with Charles and a follow-up to this keynote. And so we really hope you can join us all for that session. Is at 4 in addition to this one. I'm really looking forward to both this keynote and that conversation. Okay, so I see that it's 2 minutes past, so I want to maximize our time with Charles this lunchtime, and so want to start by welcoming you all. I'm Vicky Clark. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the policy director with Cascade Bicycle Club and Washington Bikes. Want to welcome you to the Washington Bike Walk and Roll Summit, sponsored by Amazon, presented by Amazon even. We're excited to have over 500 registrants for this 5-day virtual event. We'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. This summit is virtual, but rooted in Duwamish, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, and Suquamish land. We acknowledge the land we sit on and occupy today as the traditional home of the Duwamish, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, and Suquamish tribal nations. Without them, we would not have access to this environment. We take the opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land who are still here. I'd also like to note that we're recording this session, and all of the sessions from the summit will be available in the next week or so. Club and Washington Bikes, 2 sister statewide organizations with a shared vision of bicycling for all. Cascade serves bike riders of all ages and abilities throughout Washington state, educating new riders, advocating for safe places to ride, and holding events and rides. Washington Bikes advocates for bicyclist rights, endorses political candidates, holds officials accountable, and works to shape policies that will make bicycling safe and accessible for all. We also want to take a moment to thank our sponsors, whose collective contributions have enabled us to bring together 15 panels with expert speakers with registration free for all attendees, thanks to Amazon, our presenting sponsor. We'd also like to thank our supporting sponsors, the Washington State Department of Transportation Active Transportation Division and Eastern Washington Region. Thanks to our general sponsors, the U.S. Department of Transportation Federal Highway Administration and Stacey Bain Bike Lawyers. With that, and before we transition to introducing this summit session, we'd like to take a moment to articulate the community expectations we have for all of the summit sessions. So you see it on the screen, but we will maintain a standard of conduct to ensure that all participants feel safe and respected. We believe every person has the right to be treated with dignity and respect and to be free from all forms of harassment. We ask that you be fully present in this session, be self-responsible and self-challenging, listen and process, suspend judgment of yourself and others, use respectful language towards each other and the panel. And so I'd like to quickly introduce Charles Brown, who we're really honored to have with us today, and this keynote session. This is a keynote session that is going to be about 30 to 35 minutes long with a lot of time for questions. But as I said earlier, we're also going to have a follow-up session at 4 p.m. with Charles and some other folks to really dive into a lot of the issues that Charles is going to raise in this keynote. So this session addresses the forms of over-policing and transportation that result from racism. These forms of over-policing lead to negative and life-changing outcomes for Black and brown communities. And in order to improve the cycling community, we must work towards intersectional solutions. Charles Brown speaks to the realms of racism and forms of over-policing that lead to a system of inequity and addresses why this matters in the bike movement and why we must improve public space for all. And like I said, this is a keynote. I want to encourage all attendees to submit questions to Charles through the chat bar. If you just want to do that throughout the session, we will collect the questions and talk through them at the end. Finally, I'm going to drop at some point into the chat bar a feedback form, and we'd really appreciate you all to fill that out. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and again, just welcome, Charles.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. It is the afternoon on the East Coast. As stated, my name is Charles T. Brown. It is indeed an honor and a privilege to be here with you today. I would like to start by extending a special thanks to the entire team at Cascade Bicycle Club, its partners, and its supporters for having me here. Today, my presentation is titled Arrested Mobility, which is a phrase that I coined. We're going to talk about exploring the adverse social, political, economic, and health outcomes of over-policing Black mobility in the US. I think to get started though, I would like to kind of give you a little background on how I prepared for today's talk. So in preparing for today's talk, I was really elated to find that Cascade Bicycle Club and Washington Bikes joined the call to end violence and injustice against Black people and communities of color. Your collective statement that you believe that Black lives matter on and off the bike meant a lot to me as a racialized Black man in this country. I really appreciated the fact that you acknowledged in part also your shortcomings to date by further stating that your 50-year history of silence in response to racist violence and police brutality has harmed your community and that you will no longer be passive bystanders. You went on to state that you acknowledge the lack of national progress to dismantle structural racism and have committed to doing your part. And then lastly, you acknowledge that in order to achieve a vision for bicycling for all, you need to ensure Black Americans have the right to safety in public space and life free from injustice. I'm thankful, again, I'm elated and confident in your ability as you continue to strive to realign your work with racial equity outcomes and overall your commitment to educating yourselves and being held accountable by your community. So it is indeed in this very spirit, the reason why I am happy to be here today and to discuss my theory of arrested mobility. What is the context? Well, there are a plethora of federal, state, and local initiatives, plans, policies, programs aimed at increasing physical activity among Black people in the US. Equally, as I'm sure you are aware of, there are many bicycle organizations, advocacy organizations, that talk the talk, but do not walk the walk. I know you aren't one of those, and I'd like to ensure that that indeed continue to be held true by talking about the importance of arrested mobility today. And so in this truth, the truth that many talk the talk but don't walk the walk, you find, just like I found, that many do not ever or hardly ever achieve their goal of removing barriers to being more physically active for Black and brown people. And so one of the reasons for this begins with like the context of one of the largest and most credible organizations or initiatives that's out there. And it happens to be an initiative by the CDC. The Active People, Healthy Nations is a national initiative led by CDC to help 27 million Americans become more physically active by 2027. This sort of initiative believes that increased physical activity can improve health, quality of life, and reduce healthcare costs. They also state that these improvements can help to reduce the risk of at least 20 chronic diseases and conditions and provide effective treatment for many of these conditions. So they say in order to reach these goals, communities must implement evidence-based strategies to increase physical activity across sectors and settings. These strategies include activity-friendly routes to everyday destinations, access to places for physical activity, school and youth programs, community-wide campaigns, social and individual supports, and then lastly, prompts to encourage physical activity and equitable and inclusive access. The issue, however, or the challenges and the opportunities associated with these initiatives and others by the bicycle community is that the current description and the goal and the aim of many of these is ahistorical and apolitical, particularly in regards to the history of systemic and institutional racism within the US. The strategies also do not highlight the role of state and municipal law enforcement in discouraging and denying physical activity among Black, Indigenous people of color. Thirdly, it states equitable and inclusive access as a foundational element, but does not explicitly state it as a desired outcome or goal, with a tangible organizational commitment to funding organizations that work in Black communities. Fourth, there is no mention in this program and other programs of the overwhelming data highlighting the magnitude of unconscious bias and the criminalization of Blackness in America, particularly in light of the current climate. And then the strategies do not specifically discuss the need for institutional changes, particularly around increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then when you look at them as a whole, what you find is that many of these initiatives have been over-politicized and whitewashed in attempts to really achieve racial equity, but fall short of doing so in many communities across the country. And so when we talk about equity and we talk about racial equity, I thought it would be important to first talk about or define what I mean by equity and why it's important. In short, equity involves trying to give everyone what they need to enjoy full and healthy lives. Secondly, though, equity is the presence of justice and fairness within the procedures, the processes, and distribution of resources by institutions or systems. Please pay attention to the fact that I stated that it's within the procedures, the processes, and distributions of resources by these institutions or systems. But then thirdly, equity is more than a desktop exercise. It is more than a lens that you can put on and take off. Facing equity issues requires an understanding of the underlying or the root causes of inequality and oppression within our society. But it demands more of you when you're serious about this work. It also demands a consideration of the different social identities, whether we're talking age, gender, physical abilities or qualities, ethnicity, job levels, sexual orientation. So you must start to ask yourself as you do this equity work, a series of questions, starting with, which identities do you think about most often? Which identities do you think about least often? Which of your own identities would you like to learn more about? And which of your identities have the strongest effect on how you perceive yourself? And then lastly, which of your identities have the greatest effect on how others perceive you? When I answer the final two questions, my answer is the same. It is my race. And so then many ask, Charles, why focus on race in the context of transportation and mobility, or specifically within the bicycle community? Well, I have chosen to prioritize the race conversation in my transportation equity work in order to broaden the narrative of transportation planning. I am strongly committed to leading and centering race in all transportation decision-making processes because too often race is glazed over in planning, research, policy development, and it makes assumptions about the communities we are tasked to serve as a collective. Instead, what most of you will find is that proxies such as income, age, sex, gender, and access to a vehicle are used as alternatives to avoid centering race-based issues. This is a problem, and this is a problem because the history of structural racism, the public policies, the institutional practices, and social norms that together maintain these racial hierarchies and its impact across the country and with the communities of color are often overlooked and unacknowledged. Yet it is very pervasive and unmistakably harmful to everyone. So as planners, as policymakers, we have a professional and a moral obligation to acknowledge that the uneven development of our cities and the resulting racial, health, and wealth disparities are the result of systemic racism ingrained within the planning profession, the engineering profession, and the real estate profession, or others. Just pick one. So then, why focus on race? Because your race determines where you live. No, that is not causation, but that is certainly correlation. And here's how. Here's a map of Houston, Texas. I would like for you to pay attention to the color scheme shown in the label to the upper right, upper left. If blue represents where white people live, green represents where Black live, purple represents where Hispanic live, and the shades of pink represent where Asians and others live, what do you see in this map? Put it in the chat for me. Let's move to the Black Mecca, Atlanta, Georgia. Again, if blue represents where white people live, green represents where Black people live, purple represents where Hispanics live, what do you see in Atlanta? Let's not stop in Atlanta though, let's go to the nation's capital. If blue represents where whites live, green represents where Black live, what do you see in this map? Well, at this particular point in the presentation, many will stop me and say, is there an exception to this racial residential segregation that we see in your map? And the answer is yes, there's an exception. One exception is right near you. It's Portland, Oregon. If blue represents where white people live, green represents where Black people live, purple, Hispanic, pink, Asian, what do you see? You basically see no racialized minority groups. Now we know they exist, but in the context of this map, they're not present to the degree that they should be. But let's not pick on Portland. Portland is one of my favorite cities. Let's come a little closer to you. If blue represents where white people live, green represents where Black people live, what do you see here? Let's not stop there. Let's go to Olympia. If blue represents where white people live, green represents where Black people live, what do you see here? Now, there are some more positive examples. Once you move to Seattle, Washington, you do start to see the racial residential sort of integration that one would come to expect. But even in a place as progressive, quote unquote, as Seattle, what you still see is racial residential segregation. And why does it matter? It matters because it has impact on who lives, who dies, who's involved in a traffic collision, who is not, who has access to a home, who doesn't, whose mobility is arrested, whose mobility is not arrested. But in the context of vehicle and pedestrian crashes, we see that people of color, Blacks in particular, were 72% more likely to have been struck and killed by drivers while walking. And then when we move into the low income neighborhood, people living in neighborhoods where the median household income is $36,000 or less were killed at a much higher rate than their counterparts. Thankfully, the public health agencies are starting to see that it's not just one's risk behavior, which leads to one's disease and injury, which leads to lower life expectancy and lower and higher infant mortality rates. What we're finding is that living conditions impact risk behaviors, institutional equities impact living conditions, and then there's a bidirectional relationship between social inequities and institutional inequities that lead to the living conditions in which we are faced with changing right now. So what then are the equity implications? What we find, again, is that one's race determines one's place, which determines one's health. And when we look at the health of African Americans and other people of color in this country in the context of mobility, I theorize that our mobility has been arrested. What is arrested mobility. Arrested mobility is the assertion that Black people and other people of color have been historically and presently denied by legal and illegal authority the inalienable right to move, to be moved, or to simply exist in public space, resulting in adverse social, political, economic, and health effects that are widespread, preventable, and intergenerational. When you look at this framework that I've developed here, you can see that to the far left, arrested mobility is a direct manifestation of racism across four distinct realms: the personal realm of racism, the interpersonal realm of racism, the institutional realm of racism, and then the cultural realm of racism. These collective realms of racism have resulted in the social construct of race, locally and globally, and have thus led to the intentional and deliberate targeting and over-policing of Black and brown people. This includes not only their physical mobility, how they get around directly, but also their social mobility, how it impacts that indirectly in the US. Please understand, for all my social scientists out there, that I understand that the direct relationship between the variables as shown are much more complex and nuanced. So the question then is, how are Black people over-policed? Over-policing is evident via three distinct forms. One is zoning, residential segregation, disinvestment, etc. What we call that is policing via policy. So the first form of over-policing happens via policy. The second form of over-policing happens via law enforcement at the federal, state, and local level. And then thirdly, it happens via the self-deputization of non-Hispanic white citizens, quote unquote, the Karens and others throughout the country. And so in the context of physical mobility, the various degrees of over-policing impacts Black mobility within the realm, across the different modalities such as walking, biking, driving, taking public transit, private transit, hopping a ride via rideshare, or even using a micromobility device such as an e-scooter. And so this happens, unfortunately, even if a child is as young as 3, as my son shown here, or whether a child is taking a ride throughout the neighborhood on their father's neck. So again, understanding how over-policing arrests the physical mobility of Black people in America is of critical importance, not only for the CDC, but other national and local advocacy groups across the country who hope to improve physical activity in the Black community. And so then the most logical question that you can ask next is there evidence to support arrested mobility across these different modes of transportation? You would ask, what is that evidence? Well, let's start with walking. The most recent and notable cases of over-policing Black mobility via walking or running in the US includes the shooting deaths and murders of Ahmaud Arbery, who was jogging, Trayvon Martin, who was walking, and Mike Brown, who was also walking. When you look at the three of them, both Ahmaud Arbery and Trayvon Martin were murdered by self-deputized non-Black citizens. And Mike Brown was murdered by law enforcement. But what does the data say in regards to how Blacks are policed across this country? Well, in an analysis of 5 years of tickets issued to pedestrians in Jacksonville, Florida, what they found is that 55% of the tickets were issued to Black individuals, even though only 29% of the total population identifies Black. They also found that Blacks were 3 times more likely to receive a ticket than whites. And then residents of the city's 3 poorest zip codes were about 6 times as likely to receive a pedestrian citation. There was also this famous case where this beautiful sister, Ms. Nelson, a Black single mother and a college student, lost her son in a hit and run while crossing the street to her apartment after getting off of the bus at a bus stop located across the street, which was a divided highway. She was convicted by an all-white jury of reckless conduct, improperly crossing a roadway, and second-degree homicide. The man who killed her son was later found and admitted to drinking and taking painkillers on the night he killed her son. But I wish I could say arrested mobility ended there. It does not. It also happens, of course, in the context of cycling. So let's look at how arrested mobility manifests itself within cycling by taking a look at some of the more notable examples. Here you see three images on the screen. One represents one of the most notable and recent studies out of Chicago, which looked at biking while Black. It was a study done by the Chicago Tribune, which found that not a single majority white area ranked in the top 10 for bicycle tickets, despite biking's popularity in the whitest areas of Chicago. The other examples are going to include examples out of Tampa Bay, Florida, and also Oakland, California. So when we look at the data, what the data shows is that between 2003 to 15, Tampa police issued over 10,000 bicycle tickets. 79% of them were issued to Blacks, though they only make up 12% of they only make up 26% of Tampa's population. When we go to Oakland, 60% of all bicycle stops included Black citizens, though the population in Oakland is only about 25%. And then when we go back to, for a second, Tampa, what we found is in Tampa is that during the 12-year study period, at least 142 bike tickets were issued to kids age 15 and under. So of the 10,142 were issued to kids age 15 and under, including children as young as 3 years old. And so then as we move to Austin, Texas, what we find in Austin is that twice as many bicycle citations are written in majority Black neighborhoods than in majority white or Latino neighborhoods. And 321 tickets were issued in a low-income part of Austin versus only 5 in a higher, wider area of town in Austin, Texas. So you could see the disparities there. But I wish I could stop there with arrested mobility. I cannot. It continues also to public transit. And one of the most recent examples or notable example of over-policing Black mobility via public transit in the US includes the murder of Oscar Grant III, who was a 22-year-old Black man who was murdered by the BART police in Oakland, California. And then when we look at the data, there was a Marshall Project out of New York Division of Criminal Justice, which found that while the number of turnstile arrests have decreased significantly, what has not changed is who gets arrested. They found that 89% arrested are Black or Hispanic, virtually the same proportion in 2014. They also found in this study that the top 10 neighborhoods in New York with the highest number of arrests per subway strike were all predominantly Black. And then as a sort of example of how Black teenagers are over-policed for minor infractions, there was a young man named Adrian Napier who was tackled and aimed at by 10 police officers for fare evasion. That fare was only $2.75. And so then lastly, in 2017 in Portland, Oregon, Blacks were 8 times more likely than whites to be charged for certain transit violations. Luckily, that policy has been decriminalized as of 2018, but it goes to show again the disparity. And then I wish I could stop there, but unfortunately it continues over to driving as well. And so the most recent and notable cases of over-policing Black mobility in the US via driving, in the US, includes the murder of Philando Castile and Sandra Bland. What does the data show? The data shows that in a nationwide study looking at police trends in traffic stops, Blacks and Hispanic drivers are stopped disproportionately to white drivers. Police also are less likely to pull over Black drivers after dusk when the race of the driver is less obvious to the police. And then taking us to Minnesota, which has been like the epicenter of some of these discussions lately, a state commission study there in Minnesota found that Blacks and Latinos were 7 times more likely to be stopped by police in majority white neighborhoods. And then in 2016, 47% of the arrests by the local police department there were of Black individuals, even though the patrolled area was only 7% Black. I wish I could stop there. However, it also happens in ride sharing. And so the most notable stories I could find about ride sharing involve this research done by Stanford, MIT, and the University of Washington, where they found that rideshare drivers discriminate based on race and gender. And what the data shows is that Black travelers waited on average 20% longer than white travelers to have their ride accepted. It also took about 30% longer for Black travelers to be picked up than white travelers. And then on average, which is a scary statistic, female travelers were driven 5% further than males, given the same start and finish location. And then lastly, we see that 55% of the Blacks who call for a cab at some point have experienced a refusal by the service to send a cab to their community. And so we've gone through walking, we've gone through biking, taking public transit, and then ride sharing. And I wish I could end there, but I cannot. Because we also find that over-policing happens even when you are in your home sleeping or acting as a kid playing out in your front yard or in a local park, such in the case of Breonna Taylor and Tamir Rice. And so some of you may be wondering, we know now what the data shows, but what are the adverse social, political, economic, and health outcomes of this over-policing? And so what I'll do really quickly is go through some of the facts and then end with a series of recommendations. What are the impacts? Well, Blacks are 54% less likely to be physically active. So we talked about these initiatives to get them more active. Well, they're 54% less likely, I believe, due to their mobility being arrested. And this is a reality, whether regardless of the neighborhood or income level, or regardless of the racial composition of the neighborhood. Surprisingly, in one of the studies, we found that Black men living in predominantly white neighborhoods were far less likely to engage in physical activities in the areas surrounding their homes. And then unsurprisingly to me, because this happens to me every single day, Black men would attempt to make themselves seem less threatening. So yes, it happens. There's a process that happens in which Black men attempt to make themselves appear less threatening when going out and being physically active in their communities. Then what we find is that areas with a larger Black population tend to have lower rates of upward mobility. As I stated early on, when your physical mobility is arrested, your upward mobility is arrested as well. And then we find that upward economic mobility is a matter of whether neighborhoods have less segregation. As we stated early on in the maps, you saw the level of racial residential segregation. So think about the ways that has arrested the mobility of Blacks and thus arrested their upward mobility. Then when we move on, we find that Blacks are more likely to be uninsured. They're more likely to pay twice as much of their average household income for healthcare costs. And then the residential segregation has led to a dearth of hospitals and healthcare providers in majority Black and Hispanic areas. And then lastly, what we find here is that this sort of Blackness is disproportionately associated with the food deserts, making it worse by lack of access to transportation options. And then segregation also affects unemployment probability for Blacks much more than whites. And then the last stats that we find here, and there are million plus facts that one could show here, we find that Blacks consistently have less access to other important resources and opportunities like healthcare, supermarkets, education, and jobs. And then, of course, this affects their ability to be active in voting and other governmental things due to the lower density of polling places and other ways in which they're disenfranchised from doing so. So then to kind of close, you may ask, okay, what are some things we can do? Well, here are some strategies, and I emphasize some because I could go on and on in terms of recommending the strategies to address this arrested mobility. But some of the strategies include, first and foremost, I think there should be a call for reparation-style infrastructure packages for Black and Brown communities. Hear me again, reparation-style infrastructure package. Anything less is undesirable. It must be reparation-style. massive investments in bicycle infrastructure in these communities. And by bicycle infrastructure, ideally protected bike lanes, pedestrian infrastructure in these communities, investment in public transit, and also investments in public art. There also needs to be enhanced police accountability. We need the bicycling community, the bike walk communities to work with the police to understand and to advocate for more police accountability, because too often these organizations who are advocating for increased physical activity among Black and brown people are not aware to the degree of which Black people's mobility has been arrested. We also need to work collectively for the elimination of the scary Black male narrative. Too often there's a fear that the Black man is a criminal. There's a fear that the Black man is looking to attack, that the fear of the Black man is looking to be aggressive. We need to change the scary Black male narrative. We also need to ask for increase in data for Black lives and experiences. What's meant by that is very difficult to prove or disprove these theories because the data isn't sufficiently capturing the everyday lives and experience of Black and brown people on our roadways. We also should do a massive call for the penalization of race-based 911 calls. Right now, if you happen to be non-Hispanic white and you're calling the police on any person who's biking or walking in your community that it happens to be Black or brown, you have to be considering or cognizant of what that call may result in. So I think, similar to here in New Jersey and other states across the country, it is time for the penalization of race-based 911 calls. We also have to go back and correct what zoning has done. Many of you are aware that zoning is one of the first tools used to discriminate and to lead to some of the disproportionate outcomes that we see in society. And so we need to call for an elimination of the racialized zoning that has wrecked our communities. In addition to that, there's no way you can have what you saw in Portland, what you saw in Olympia and other parts, this sort of segregation by race that you see without racialized zoning. And then we need more courage from our white allies. I strongly believe that the bicycle community, the walking community, you all are the biggest advocates. The super majority of you care about the issues in Black and brown communities. I need you, we need you though, to be more vocal. And then lastly, we don't need to just think about getting people on a bike or having people walk more. We gotta start thinking about people's mental health, not only in the Black and brown communities, but in the white communities as well. So as a community, we should start advocating for more mental health services. And then I'll close with, many of you say you understand what we as racialized Black and brown people are going through in this country, in the bicycle community. But I think you must understand that no, we're not in the same boat. We're in the same storm. And there's a huge, huge difference. And to show you how different it is, as Black people in this country, we are extremely tired. We can't go jogging. We can't relax in the comfort of our own homes. We can't walk from the corner store. We can't get a normal traffic ticket. We can't have a disabled vehicle. We can't run. We can't breathe. We can't even live. And we can't do so. And I really need you to understand this because our mobility has been arrested. I want to thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure being here. Here's my contact information at Rutgers, as well as my personal contact information. Feel free to reach out to me. Again, it's been a pleasure, and I want to thank Cascade, its partners, and others for having me here. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. You know, I think on behalf of everyone, thank you. That was a lot of information, a lot of sobering information, and kind of just want to sit with it for a second. Do you want to encourage people? We have about 20 minutes to ask Charles all of our questions. Since no one has asked a question yet, I get to ask some of my questions. But yeah, I really want to encourage folks. You know, I want to say, as we said at the beginning of this is really a safe space to ask questions. And you know, I think certainly myself as a white person have always wanted to have the right answer, right? And I think I've learned that just waiting until you have the right answer means you're waiting a really long time. And so I want to just encourage you to all be vulnerable and ask questions. I think something that's sort of top of mind for me, I appreciate we're all in the same storm, not in the same boat. I think a piece of the storm right now is obviously COVID-19, and I want to just see, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on how COVID-19 has impacted and exacerbated impacts on instances of arrested mobility and over policing.
That's a great question. Well, first and foremost, I would like to let everyone know who's lost a family member, regardless of your race, your ethnicity, or your income, that my thoughts and my prayers go out to you. In talking about COVID-19, I get teary-eyed because I lost an uncle this year to COVID-19. He was a man who was like my father. My mother also got sick with COVID-19 and other members of my family back in Mississippi. So while I have felt the collective pain and trauma on a national level, I've also felt it within my own family. And so for that reason, my thoughts and prayers go out to everyone who's impacted by it. In the context of mobility, what COVID-19 has shown really is who the essential workers are and who need the transportation options the most. And what you find, and it is, well, those who need it the most are those who have been racialized as Black and brown in this country, as well as low-income people in this country. What we find in some cities is that even though on an aggregate level, transit ridership is down, it's not down to the same degree in Black and brown and low-income communities. Guess why? Because even though COVID is there, they still need that mode of transport. So when we think about getting back to transit levels of ridership and investments prior to COVID, I would advocate that we spend more money towards increasing the comfort, the frequency, and the use of transit in Black and brown communities. COVID-19 has showed they need it the most. When you look at biking and walking, many of the essential workers disproportionately are Black and brown people, many of them depending on the subway system, the bikes, and the walking paths to get to and from work. And so if that's the case, and also considering that they're more likely to be hit and killed by a car, once we rebound, we should invest more in those communities, because not only is it wise and just and right to do so, but that will also be the biggest bang for our buck, given that that's how we're going to increase the number of people who are walking and biking in our communities, by bringing up those who currently have a barrier to doing so. So COVID-19 has sort of shown us who the essential workers are, who depends most on these transportation options, is now it's up to us to advocate for that.
Thanks. I want to echo a couple of comments in the chat about being sorry for your personal loss. That's really hard.
Thank you, Vicky. Love your accent too.
Love you also. And thanks, folks, for posting really good questions in the chat. You know, I think one that is sort of specific to biking is, let me see if I can find it here, is your thoughts on how you address the need for much needed infrastructure in communities of color without making them more vulnerable to gentrification and displacement. I think we hear that fear around protected bike lanes. I know you explicitly mentioned protected bike lanes in the presentation.
Yeah, so people, I mean, there's a great book out there, White Lanes or Bike Lanes. I love the book. I had an opportunity, I think her name is Melanie, to meet her in person and be on a panel with her. I respect that the findings in that book. What my research has shown me, however, is that when you interview Black and brown people, they've stated, because I've asked the question specifically, would you like a bicycle lane on your street? And nearly 90% of those who responded to that question stated that they would indeed like a bicycle lane on their street. So while there is some fears and concern around gentrification due to infrastructure investments, I still found that they wanted the bicycle lane. I think the fear comes in because what tends to happen in these communities is not that gentrification happens once the bike lane comes. What they see happening is that bike lanes are pushed on them without any consideration for their other needs and concerns. I've seen this happen in many of public meetings where engineers and planners go there to talk about bicycle lanes. The community wants to talk about access to jobs, access to other opportunities. So then the engineers and planners will leave and say, well, they don't want bike lanes because they think they lead to gentrification. No, what they want is for you to listen to them and understand that it's not such a silo discussion for Black and Brown communities. Everything is very intersectional. I like how you preface the question by saying, let's find something now that relates to biking. In the Black community, all things relate to biking. When your mobility has been arrested through policy, through enforcement, and through the self-deputization of white citizens. So the point I'm making here is that we can't talk about biking without talking about other things. Because if you don't prevent the barriers that don't allow me to simply exist in public space, we can't move forward to biking. You have to first get me out of the house in a safe manner.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And it reminds me of something that I've heard recently about the whole idea of like modal planning in cities is kind of misses the point of it's really about mobility. It's not about a bike or a sidewalk.
Correct.
So another question, obviously, I think your point really well made about segregation. It was, seems like it's really core to a lot of the issues. What do you think are some of the best examples of the elimination of racialized zoning?
What Minneapolis just did, where they, effectively, got rid of single family zoning. If people want to look at one of the best case examples, I think that is one of the best case examples. I'm also a part of a group with a law firm where we're working with cities across the country to help them assess their zoning practices to see the ways in which they have been used to discriminate and to design a community in a way that prioritizes some but disenfranchises others. So that's another way. I could share that offline. I didn't want to plug that here. But I think the Minneapolis case is one of the better cases on how to address racialized zoning.
Thanks. And then kind of staying like big high level, I guess. How do you see arrested mobility playing out in rural communities or suburbs versus in cities? There's a difference?
I think your mobility is arrested even more in rural areas and in the suburb due to the power dynamics. I think it's important right now for me to let people know I probably grew up in one of the most rural places of anyone in your chat right now. I grew up in a town called Sugar Lock, Mississippi, that has a population of only 500 people. There, and in other similar places across the country, if you're Black and Brown, the police forces tend not to necessarily reflect, even though in my town they did, the population in which they're serving. But I think you're much more vulnerable because they're see these officers much more frequently. Whereas in a city, I think you're protected due to the fact that, you see thousands of people, different people every day, if not hundreds of thousands of different people every day in a place like New York and Chicago. So the likelihood of you personally interacting with a law enforcement officer, I think is probably less likely. So I think people's mobility may be arrested even more in the rural areas and in some of the suburbs compared to the city. So this is not a city issue. This is an issue regardless of geography or context. What matters here is race and ethnicity, as I stated, which is why I tend to focus on the race piece, because that's the determining variable.
Thank you.
May I also say one other thing, Vicky?
Yeah, sure.
I want to clarify that when I talk about police, I'm not talking about a police force that is all white, policing an all Black or Hispanic neighborhood. I'm talking about policing as an institution. And whether it's an all Black police force or an all white police force, I think what you find is that policing as an institution has arrested the mobility of Black people in this country. So that's true of the Olympias the same way it's true of the Baltimore police force.
Makes sense. So another piece of, I think, a big overarching theme is sort of intersectionality. And so I want to take us away from biking. And I think there's a couple of questions that ask around about stuff that is not specific to mobility. And so I'm going to bunch them together. Who's organizing around reparation style infrastructure packages, either on a local, regional, or state level? I'd love to hear more about that. And then,
no one that I've heard of, which is why I said it.
Oh, it's a really neat idea.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other question is about wanting to hear more about changing the stereotypes, beliefs, narratives of the scary or threatening Black man. What is that work? Is it in, like at the institutional level, individual level? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, great question. I also noted, so I think it's both. I think it has to happen at the individual level, where one should seek to meet a stranger. And in this particular case, if you are white, go out and meet someone Black, be intentional about it, get to know people. At the institutional level, I think it's important that we address the media, the ways in which they sort of cast Black people in movies, the way Blacks are shown in plays, the way Blacks are shown in all the different images. There tends to be an aggression that's associated with the Black male in a way that's not spoken about in a positive sense, but in a negative sense. And so I think we need to do some reprogramming of all of our minds to understand that Black males are not out to criminalize anyone or to harm anyone. But because we've been socialized through this country to believe so, it's time now that we unlearn. I hit a milestone birthday, 25. And what I found is that once I hit 25, I had to do a lot of unlearning. You realize that a lot of the things that you have been taught about people and places in this country were not factual. They were really just lies. And so it behooves every individual and institution, which is a group of individuals, to unlearn and to learn what is right. And so that's up to the individuals. But I'm here to work with anyone that wants to learn because I like learning with people regardless of where you are.
Thanks. So I think we have time to squeeze in a couple more questions here.
Yeah, let's do it. Rapid fire. Let's do it.
Yeah, well, and I know that there's a lot of grassroots advocate folks here with us today. And so
those are my people.
Great.
Let's get to it.
So, I mean, just in a broad sense, how can local bike communities work against these trends of arrested mobility, and what do these solutions look like on a grassroots level?
Well, first and foremost, these advocacy groups, whether in Washington, Georgia, New Jersey, or New York, are not diverse enough. These groups, these bicycle advocacy groups, tend to be very white. So one of the ways in which you can change that is by bringing more people of color into your organizations, and not bringing them there just to be tokenized, but bringing them also to kind of share in power. And I think once you do that, you'll start to hear things such as arrested mobility by people you now have a relationship with. So the way that you change arrested mobility on a local level is that, again, you advocate for more infrastructure in these communities. You take a look at the racialized zoning laws that are put in place to keep people separate. And then thirdly, you don't say, let's leave policing up to police. I think you have to advocate for ways around enforcement that are more just and fair. And so the biking, the walking community has, I think, a moral obligation to seek social justice within the way that they design, but also interact with the community. So it's everyone's business. And of course, get more of the youth involved. Absolutely.
Yeah. Definitely going to go back and rewatch this because there's just like there's so much packed into everything you say, and I really appreciate every time I get a chance to talk with you. I think something that you touched on just a little bit is, but I want to, I guess, explicitly ask the question, how can white allies and accomplices show up without co-opting Black advocates?
Show up. So the narratives out there is that, oh, white people show up and, of course, they co-opt. The problem isn't the co-option. The problem is they don't show up most times. They don't show up and be courageous in the way that they need to be courageous. I want to focus on the positive here. I need more white allies to show up. Let's just start there. Then we can worry about this issue of co-option. The same way when you talk about needing more bicycle infrastructure in Black and brown communities, the first question is, what about gentrification? So gentrification is another way of saying something has been co-opted. It's not important to talk about that when you're talking to me, at least. I would like you to be there first, and then let's strategize around ways in which we can work collectively to improve these communities. I think now, if you want me to be honest, that many of my well-meaning white friends are using those as excuses to not show up, because they're going to say, well, I can't be as brave because I'm co-opting. Or I can't advocate for bicycle lanes in your community because I'm increasing gentrification. I don't think that's I don't think that's wise. I think that's a cop-out. And I want to call people on that. I think you can do better. Because when I asked the question on Twitter, why don't white allies speak up? They told me it's because they fear for their job. They fear that they'll be ostracized from their social groups. They fear of going against the system. And so those are the real reasons, not because you think a community is going to be gentrified or you're going to co-opt something. You're simply fearful that you will lose something individually. And the sort of love that I'm calling for on a mass scale is a love in which you're willing to sacrifice some for yourself in order for others to gain. That's what I'm asking for.
We have another minute, but I think that is just like a great place to leave that in terms of the questions. And I want to offer to you, if you have any last any last words of advice.
Yeah, I have last words.
Okay, great.
My youngest child is 2 years old, going on 3. If by the time he's 25, the maps that I put up of Washington still look the same, we've all failed in terms of the racial segregation that exists. That is by design. And if you're advocating for bikes, but you're not advocating for Black and brown people to be free, whether they're on a bike or not, then what you're really advocating for is to increase biking to the benefit of you, not them. And so people need to be more courageous. That's what it's all about. Love for thy neighbor, the same way you have love for thyself. And so that's what I want to see, a place that is truly diverse, truly inclusive. I want a bicycle community that doesn't have just Black bicycle groups, white bicycle groups. I want us all together enjoying America the way we know how we can do it. And so that's what I would love to see. And I hope we all get there together.
I just want to thank you for bringing just equal measures, inspiration, and just real words and real talk. And I think things that people, myself included, really need to hear. I'm really looking forward to reconnecting in like 3 hours for the 4 o'clock session. I want to encourage everyone who's here to join us at that, and also to fill out the feedback form that is in the chat, and we'll repost.
May I say one last thing before you close? This theory of arrested mobility kept me up many nights. And I'm saying this now to the bicycle community, because what I really want you to do is to pause, to stop for a second, and to consider the ways in which the communities and the individuals you're seeking to serve, their mobility is being arrested. How does that impact your work? I'm simply asking for people to pause.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's 1:30. I think this is done. I would love to keep talking.
All right, well, you take care. It's been a pleasure.
But yeah, thanks again, Charles, and we'll connect with you again at 4 o'clock.
All right, take care.
Time that is on the East Coast. Thanks.
All right, bye-bye.